read Brian Rolling's Substack where he really unpacked that Navigator survey. This is Brian. He is the author
Nice to
and
meet you.
co-founder of Murmur, he writes a Substack. So say hello.
Yeah, and I actually,
Uh,
Brian, they shared your Substack with me, and I read, which I think is why it was front of mind. I
that is
love what you've done, so I'm looking forward
that
to.
is beyond flattering because I've stolen from your Twitter feed multiple times in Substack. So thank you.
Bringing people together. That's what the grassroots are all about. That's what we always say.
It's good to meet
Well,
you.
Brian,
Likewise.
yeah, great. So yeah, the two of you kind of, working from the same playbook here. I just love that Tom got into the data. Brian has been focusing on more of the messaging and understanding some of this because he's in that media space. So welcome, Brian.
Hello, thank you
Great.
for having me. It's fun to be here.
Great. So as I mentioned before, you're founder and chief video officer, which I love that title for Murmur
Made
and
up
Murmur
title, but I like
Impact.
it.
Perfect. We're not big fans of hierarchies, but we all have different titles, so you can't really tell who's in charge. The way it works.
Smart.
So anyway, welcome. And I'm so glad that Tom mentioned that Navigator our survey because this is just so right on time coming after Tom because the article that really resonated with me was why a progressive media ecosystem is not enough to defend MAGA. And that was your article in the Substack. So I really can't wait for you to unpack that. But before we get started, I would be remiss to not point out a fact that your mom is a real badass. And I grew up in the South. Where I live, everyone asks me, who's your father? But you, in this case, of course, we're Friday Power Lunch. We're badass women. So I'm going to
Of
ask
course.
you, Brian, who is your mother? Can you tell us?
My mother's name is Rochelle Davis. She is a lifelong community organizer. She in eighth grade, if she was here, she would introduce herself by telling the story that in eighth grade she led a protest in her middle school to allow girls to wear pants, and that was sort of her first bite in victories. And from then, she worked at the Midwest Academy, Citizen Action, and then started her own organization that really worked at it's called the Healthy Schools Campaign, that really worked at sort of the intersection of health, healthy food, and education. And she did that for 30 years, and now she's working with me at Murmur, actually. So it's a family operation.
That's fantastic. Well, she was a good mom. She raised you right.
I,
So
I
in
think
that
so,
article,
hopefully.
right. So we're all grassroots leaders on this call. We're all involved. We're focusing on engaging volunteers, but I wanted you to talk about these low engagement voters that Tom talked about. And I want you to help us understand what you think who are these folks? Help us understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the highest level, I think it's actually the majority of eligible and registered voters. I think most voters would fall into what I would define as low engaged. Navigator defined it as people who responded to a survey as that politics is not too important to them or not at all important to them, and found that that was like a third of the electorate. I think when you look at folks who consistently vote in primaries, midterms, and general elections, those folks are in the minority of voters. And if you look across the folks who are voting in and out of elections, it's actually the majority of voters. So Pew looked at this, actually, this was pre-2024, and they saw that in 2018, 2020, and 22, only 37% of the electorate voted in all three of those elections. So if you're consistently voting in primaries, midterms, and elections, you're in the minority of voters. And the folks who are popping in and out, voting once or twice, maybe skipping midterms, but always doing general, obviously it's a big group, so it's going to be different. They're sort of low engaged voters. And I think these are folks who are not engaging with political content, who are not, thinking about this all the time. And I think understanding the difference between like engaged voters, which all of us on this call are, and folks who are a little bit less engaged, who are not as active in politics, understanding that difference to me is critical to sort of understanding the electorate, how we should talk to voters, and how we kind of come back from this wilderness, if you will.
So are these low engagement voters low information voters, or are they just different information voters?
I like to think of them as different information voters. I think that, you can think of someone at like a Tea Party rally holding up a sign that says, keep the government out of my Medicare, as someone who's very engaged, but maybe not super informed. So I don't know if there's like a correlation between engagement and informed. I think if you talk to some low engaged voters, you talk to a nurse, they're going to be really smart about like healthcare policy, but they may not be very engaged. If you talk to a car dealer or a contractor, for instance, they're going to know about like zoning policies in their city and in their state, but they may not be someone that we classify as engaged. So I think we can't think of these folks as like low info. I think we have to think of them as low engaged and then differently informed. And there's definitely a correlation between where you get your news source, as we've been seeing in things that Navigator has done, and Pew has put out some studies, and who you supported, right? And if you were sort of a mainstream media follower, if you read the newspaper, if you watch TV, you are much more likely to vote for Harris. And if you're someone who's getting your news from social media, is getting your news from other sources, you are much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So there's a different ecosystem, which is frustrating, but I wouldn't always classify these people as just low info.
So that they would probably respond really well to those buzzwords and the little sound bites, as we called them in the 90s.
Yeah, they love short talking points that seem very pre-planned.
Easy. And they and things that are repeated easily and often. Yeah.
Yes,
they
I mean,
pick
I
up on
think I think people, I think a lot of I'm heavily involved in people like under 40 and sort of the millennial Gen Z vote, and I've studied, I think a lot about that, and I work a lot on those issues, and like, if you're someone who's not engaged, not seeking out political podcasts, not reading political Substacks, not, turning on the news, you're learning about the world through an algorithm, and it's just popping in and out. And it's little sound bites here and there through your Twitter feed, through TikTok, through YouTube. Maybe you're listening to a podcast that talks a little bit about, cancel culture. You're like, oh, that's interesting. So you're getting just like little bits of things from people and learning about the world from places that are apolitical. And so what seeps into those worlds is really important for us to understand, and how we seep into those worlds is really important. And I think certainly Trump and the magosphere has done a much better job getting outside their right-wing media ecosystem to find voters, specifically young men, on places that are not political in nature, but have become political. So I think a lot about like Theo Von and Andrew Schulz and like these comedian podcasts. The right wing saw very early that comedian podcasts had a big male following, an apolitical or non-political following, but were turned on or sort of engaging on cancel culture. And so they talked to folks about cancel culture. They talked about all of these things that, I don't particularly find to be super compelling or real, but it connected, and that was their inroad with that audience, and they did a lot better with young men in the last election. I think they made connections over a 4-8 year span with these sort of non-political entities that have become political. Joe Rogan's probably the greatest example of that, but there's a lot of other examples, I think, that the right wing has courted, and I think the idea that progressive media is not enough. It's not enough for us to just build a bigger bubble. We need to like get outside, and we need to figure out how can we connect with the influencers, with the podcasts, with just regular people who are not going to come to the new podcast, who don't want to listen to the left-wing Joe Rogan, right? But there are places that we can connect them. I think Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy was like a great example of that, right? That's a non-political entity, but the host of that was very sort of worked up around abortion rights, and Kamala Harris went on her podcast and talked to her. But it can't be a campaign strategy. It has to be a long-term communication strategy that we're doing every single day that then any campaign can adopt.
It seems like, we studied in undergrad, like the pull versus the push, right? And those apolitical things are more like a pull strategy. And as I asked you before, your website and your projects, your video projects, if people go out and visit the Murmur Impact, the website, you'll see that you do target Gen Zs, but I am certain that Gen Zs are not hanging out on Substack. That's the impression I get. I've been watching some video podcasts on Substack, and I'm not going to name names, but they're thinking that they're, creating this, media empire, and it's just dry, older white people. And it's just not,
Yeah.
I just don't see that as coming across well to the Gen Z. I just don't see them on the Substack space.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're getting their news from TikTok. We did a survey early in the election cycle when Biden was still the nominee with a focus group actually with 50 undecided Gen Z voters, and I was shocked at how much of them said Twitter was still where they were getting most of their news. And so they're they're living, and myself, I'm an older millennial, but I live in an ecosystem of algorithms, swipes, small little bites, and then okay, maybe I'll go down a rabbit hole to learn more if my interest is piqued. But it's coming very fast, very frequent, and in small increments, and they're not necessarily seeking out information. So a platform like Substack, where you go to, you subscribe, you sort of opt in, is they're less likely, I think, to be there just by what their information habits are.
And I think that this group, we're all activists here, and this group's going to really have to relearn some things to try to be effective. I also wanted to go back to something that you said in your article about this 4%, that you had interpreted this discussion with the Navigator survey about people who disapproved of Trump, yet voted for him anyway. And it was about a 4% number that I saw. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you think that might be ripe for us to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, even bigger than just that sort of discrepancy, like low engaged voters, they're hard to reach, but I think they're more persuadable. They're going to be a little bit less sort of rigid in their partisanship. And, at that Navigator survey had Trump won the people who said not at all important to them by 6 points, and 60% of them disapprove of him personally. So there's an enormous group of people that don't like Donald Trump and voted for him. That's where we come back, right? And I think the 4% number was looking at his approval rating coming out of exit polls, which, we can put as much weight into exit polls as we want, having him about 45%, and he won 49% of the vote. So that 4% of the total electorate, but even in less engaged, it becomes bigger, where there's folks who don't approve of Donald Trump personally. They may have some rose-colored glasses on his last presidency, but that's where we come back, right? These folks want lower gas prices, lower groceries, more affordable housing. Trump's not going to deliver on those things. I think we feel pretty confident about that. Our job is to make sure people know that. My question is not, is Trump going to deliver for voters? My question is, can we have a shared reality where we understand that he didn't? And I think that's my biggest concern, that in 2 years, in 4 years, we're going to be at a place where it's like he didn't do any of these deliveries, but we're so fragmented. We're just talking to each other, and we're not reaching the right people, and they don't know that. And that
We do
that
not
is
have, you're
my
right.
biggest fear.
Right. We do not have a shared reality. 100%. We do not have a shared reality. And that came across loud and clear when I saw after the Republicans lost last time, they said, well, we need to improve our messaging to Blacks and minorities. And I'm thinking, how about you just stop taking their rights away? I mean, you can't message
Right.
over that. Well, guess what, friends? You can message over that because they just won. And I can't understand it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So we're really happy to have you on. I hope you can stay for the after chat. Because I
sure.
do want to turn it back. I just want to mention that this is Brian Rolling, and he is the Chief Video Officer and founder for Murmur Impact, the website, and his Substack is Murmur's Impact. And we've really enjoyed, Murmur's Substack rather, and we've really enjoyed talking with you today.
I bet you that Brian.
Thanks so much.
Wait, don't go away yet. Don't, Laura, keep him here because I think Fennell probably has something to say. I know I do.
Yeah, listen, I agree with all the data, and
Right.
I think one thing that I just think that sometimes, and I know if Miss Margaret is listening, if she's here today, she would be saying this too. Let's not forget that misogyny is colorblind, and that race had a lot to do with this election too. And so I think when we're thinking about some of the swings and some of the things that happen, we cannot forget that impact, and we do have to think strategically about how we make sure that we bring the right coalitions together and that we're talking about it in the right way. So
well,
I just
remember
think
that we thought these Gen Z kids, I've said it myself.
Yeah.
I believe that we thought they were kind of post-racial at this point and that they had been moving on to some of the sexual identity that just being a mom of this generation, I can tell you that that is their identity discussion. And I was just so surprised. I feel like I'm that post-Obama moment again. Like, can't believe they all hate us so much. But I'm really just surprised, given what the way I've raised my children, what I hear their friends talk about,
Right.
that the racism was that over with that generation. It's just shocking to me.
Let Brian. I know Brian has a comment. Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I think to that point, like there is certainly a section of Gen Z that is extremely progressive, extremely active, extremely activated, and is doing some like amazing work. We also have to remember that there's a large chunk of Gen Z that grew up isolated, learning on Zoom, stay at home, had some key developmental years taken from them because of COVID, grew up with, school shooting drills. When I grew up, we had tornado drills, right? They are entering a world where they're not going to be able to afford rent, forget buying a house. They are entering a world where, average household income's going down. So like there's a lot sort of pressuring on them. And that may be true about every generation when they hit that age. But like, I think among Gen Z, so there's a lot of like, anger towards institutions, anger towards the status quo. And then I think that isolation can create that misogyny, creates that racism, and they become radicalized on YouTube, on Twitter, and all these other places. And so that's happening.
Radicalized. Yes.
Yeah, I know we're going to have to go to the after chat, but I do want to say something that I think is important to say, because I hear you, Brian, but it also sometimes it just gets on my nerves because I just say, well, yeah, that's just like being Black. Okay, so let's move on. But because you see what I'm saying here? It's like, oh my goodness, they just feel so bad. Well, that's what we grew up with. That's what people are still experiencing right now because of race. And I think this whole the
Right.
conversation that Republicans have around diversity is exactly that. And if you just look at the audience who are the people at Trump rallies, they're young women, they're young
Yeah.
men. And they go and they hear this stuff. So I just think it's a bigger thinking conversation to have, especially
Yeah.
about how we go about talking to the different groups of people. And I do think that
Uh-oh, he
people on
thinks.
this call
Mhm.
will have to get more comfortable with talking to people who look like them, and the less comfortable, the ones who are more comfortable, instead of, you know what I'm saying? So we've
Yeah,
got to
yeah.
do something different. Big thinking has to happen.
Big thinking, and I'm going to do that. Thank Brian and say we're going to be in more conversations. I hope that we can do this on Substack together because we had so much fun.
Please.
We're not done. It's going to be constant because there's so much to talk about. Even with this, we see Tom's number showing exactly what you're talking about, right? 30 and under, less engaged, stay at home. We have some issues, and a lot to do with the way society is. Thank you. We're going to wrap up, and we'll be back in the after chat. So hold on,
Thank you.
buckle in, everybody.